good to be back with you for another day of Bible study as we continue on through reConstruct. We're working through this curriculum right here, which is put out, thankfully, by Christ Table, and you can be a part of this study if you would like by going to go.christtable.today/reconstruct, and there you will find the schedule and all the resources and everything that you will need to be a part of this study with us. We even have a few extra books and curriculum packets there that we'd love to send you a box in the mail, and you can get all the information on that right there at go.christtable.today/reconstruct. Today we find ourselves on day 3 in Nehemiah chapter. Actually, that is the wrong text. Today's text, let me see if I can just put it right up here for us. Today's text is Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 11b through Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 8. So, yeah, there we go. That is the correct text for our study today. Let's dig in. We are following the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah in the Old Testament, who is a citizen, or at least historically his ethnicity is Israelite, but he has been living and working in Babylonia because his people were conquered and taken into captivity. And it may well be, and likely is, that Nehemiah was actually born in captivity, and so he had never lived in Israel or in Palestine, had never been to that location, but it was still considered his home, and it was certainly where his roots are. So when we pick up the story today, we pick up the story in Nehemiah chapter 1, the very second half of the last verse in the chapter, which says, "In those days I was the king's cupbearer." Now, we would just kind of run right through this because Nehemiah is kind of given his resume here, but this is a very important piece of information. In fact, this piece of information may be the one sentence that unlocks an understanding of the rest of the story. And so we want to spend just a few moments here talking about Nehemiah's resume, and one thing being on that resume, and that's a cupbearer. Now, as you might imagine, in those days, it was a pretty cutthroat time in ancient cultures where it was kill or be killed, and there weren't a lot of like police forces. There wasn't a CIA and FBI in order to track down and make people pay. You were only as good as your ability to stay alive, especially as a king. And if somebody was able to off you, then your dynasty would end, or there would be a change of regimes if a coup happened. And so people were always, at least people in power, were always looking over their shoulder to ensure that there weren't any coups, hostile takeovers, regime changes, murders. And so the cupbearer was the most important person in the kingdom, because the cupbearer was the person who was the last line of defense against poisoning. Poisoning is the easiest and simplest way to off somebody in ancient times. No blood on your hands. Nobody sees who did it. You are anonymous, and it's a very simple way to kill someone. And so the cupbearer was the most important person in the kingdom, because the cupbearer would drink everything first and would eat everything first before the king, queen, or person in power did themselves. So this person became a highly trusted individual. They were always around, especially at meal times, tasting things, eating the same food as the king and the queen. They became an advisor, somebody to bounce ideas off of, somebody to sit and grieve with in those meals that were difficult, and it needed to be a person who you trusted. Now, the interesting thing about a cupbearer was that because they were around the king, they were also around the queen and the harem at all times. Now, a king wanted to be able to trust the cupbearer so that poison did not make its way to the king's table, but a king also wanted to trust the cupbearer because the cupbearers had access to all of the women. This was a very important thing to ensure that the cupbearer was not going to be taking advantage or enjoying himself on the side. And so it was, by and large, a requirement in ancient times that the cupbearers would be solely dedicated to the king and not be able to be wooed by other women into maybe perhaps doing something that would cause the king harm. So, by and large, cupbearers in ancient times were eunuchs. Now, eunuch is a word that is still in use, but not much. So I want to take a moment here to just kind of explain to us what a eunuch is. A eunuch is a man who has been castrated, especially in ancient times, one who is employed to guard the women's living areas at a palace court. And so what we're seeing here is that a man's testicles would have been removed so that there would be no testosterone, there would be no drive. And part of the thing is that we know from ancient times, even during this time, that eunuchs were raised to be a eunuch, which means that it's not like a job you're going to go and apply for once you get out of rabbinical school. It's not like you're going to go and say, okay, I'm going to allow myself to be castrated so that I can have this job as a fully matured man. No, by and large, almost completely, the people who were eunuchs and who became cupbearers and people who worked in the palace around the queen and around the harem were raised from before adolescence as being a eunuch. It means that they were castrated at a young age intentionally as a career path towards being a cupbearer, towards being a prominent person, hopefully in the king's palace. If that worked out, like for Nehemiah, wonderful. If it didn't, sucks to be you. So it is nearly certain that Nehemiah, as a cupbearer, especially in a regime that is as large as Babylonia was at this point, that he would have been a eunuch, which means, and we reference this a little bit in our curriculum today, which means that by definition, and this may hit some buttons for some of you, but I'm just going to put it out there, okay? By definition, Nehemiah was queer. Now, there are multiple definitions and understandings today to what the term queer means. It would not have been a term that was used back then, but today it's kind of an umbrella term. I just want to kind of walk through this definition, which is not mine. An adjective used by some people whose sexual orientation is not exclusively heterosexual or straight. This umbrella term includes people who have non-binary, gender fluid, or gender non-conforming identities. Once it was considered a pejorative term, but queer has been reclaimed by some QIA plus people to describe themselves. However, it's not universally accepted term even within that community. And so I think that it's important here for us to see that what is being kind of described here is a situation that is a bit undescribable. Somebody who is in a median space or a liminal space between clearly defined categories, not exclusively heterosexual or straight. Includes people who are non-binary, who are not, by that meaning, not fully male in who they are or what their identity is, either emotionally, identity-wise, sexually, DNA. Also some, or who is not binary on the other side, either a gender fluid. This is exactly what would have been a description of ancient eunuchs. They would have not reached a point of maturity. They would have been male, but they would have never progressed beyond a prepubescent male's physical form, emotional situation. Without any of that testosterone in their body, it would have created what I think is best described as a third gender. And we see this in ancient texts. We actually see this in the Bible. If you will follow the term eunuch and follow through the treatment, especially early on in the Bible. Now that changes as we move through the Old Testament and as we move into the New Testament and further on. God actually changes and addresses the way that gender non-conforming people like Nehemiah, who is a eunuch, as a third gender are treated. This is extremely important because Nehemiah would have been an outsider who was an insider. He's an outsider because he's not of Babylonian descent. He's not Persian, and so he's an outsider, but he has a very prominent job. But he's also an outsider because he is not female. He is not fully male. He is this third category, and we know that they were treated differently in ancient times, much the way, unfortunately, people who are non-conforming are treated today. This, as we know, whenever somebody is treated as an outsider, oftentimes changes the way that someone interacts, whether you're male, female, fully, or on the spectrum, somewhere in between. No matter how you identify sexually, all of us understand what it looks like to either feel or to know somebody who has been treated as an outsider and how that affects the person, how that affects us. It causes us to try to win over people. It causes the person to oftentimes try to fit in, to cover up who they are. Oftentimes the class clown is somebody who is trying to cover up insecurities in order to present themselves in a way that will allow themselves to be accepted by everybody else who they feel they don't fit in with. And this would have been the reality for a lot of eunuchs, a lot of queer individuals in the Old Testament. And if we pay close attention to Nehemiah and how he talks, how he interacts, the things that he is offended by, the things that trigger Nehemiah, and if we also look at the goals of Nehemiah, I think what we're going to see is we're going to see a lot of truth in that. A lot of the motivations for Nehemiah as we track through this book are going to be rooted in his identity as a eunuch and his feelings and insecurities associated with that. For instance, he is Jewish, but by Jewish law, he's not allowed in the temple to worship as a eunuch. That's going to affect an individual. How do we reconcile that? How do we as an individual, if we're Nehemiah, deal with that? A nation whom we love, whom we want to support, whom we want to help, whom we feel a part of, but who always keeps us at arm's length. So Nehemiah does everything that he can to get God to embrace him. And we're going to see that as we move forward. So Nehemiah, let's just keep moving forward, goes to the king, and the king sees that he's sad. Whether or not Nehemiah is just putting on a show, we don't know. But either way, Nehemiah has a lot on his mind and a lot on his heart. And the king asks, and Nehemiah says, all of this is going on back in my homeland. I would love to be a part of helping solve the problem of the destroyed city. And so this is how he frames it to the king. With a prayer to the God of heaven, He replies to the king, if it please the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried. I think it's interesting here that Nehemiah does not mention the wall or the gates of the city. We already know from a little earlier in the text that Nehemiah knows that the primary concern and his primary job, the primary need, is to get the wall rebuilt, to get the gates rebuilt, to keep people out. Nehemiah doesn't frame it in this way to the king in the beginning. He just frames it as a rebuilding project for the city. Nehemiah knows that the king has declared that the wall will not be rebuilt. So Nehemiah is going to have to work the system here and work the relationship in order to get the king to relent and go back on his decree. Don't manipulate others, even if it's for a good cause. What Nehemiah is doing here is manipulation on both ends. We see hints of Nehemiah manipulating the king, and we see hints of Nehemiah even manipulating God, and we'll see hints of Nehemiah manipulating the people in order to do what he wants them to do. Don't do that, even if it's for a good cause, because the contention here is that what Nehemiah thinks is a good cause is not actually what is best for the people and not what God desires and what God wants. And yet Nehemiah continues to frame this as a crusade on behalf of God, when God has already said that his desire is that they would be a people who would interact with all nations and would not disconnect from all nations, but would be a people who would allow others to be a part of the worshiping community. Every nation, every tribe, every tongue is the goal. It's not what they want. They want their kingdom, not God's kingdom. Nehemiah thinks it's a good cause, so it's okay to manipulate. It's never okay. He also says to the king, if it please the king, let me have letters addressed to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, instructing them to let me travel safely through their territories on my way to Judah. Nehemiah knows that the surrounding communities are not going to be a fan of this happening. And so now he needs more than permission. He needs protection, which should be a clue that this may not be something that should be done. Give me a letter addressed to Asaph, the manager of the king's force, instructing him to give me timber. I'll need it to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress, for the city walls, and for a house for myself. You see how you just got to wedge that in there? I'm not going to just need your permission. I'm not going to just need your protection, but I'm also going to need resources. I'm going to need resources. You know, the house of worship, the people need a house of worship. So we're going to need some timber. Can you help me get some timber to help rebuild the gates of the temple? Also, I'm going to need a real city wall and a house for myself. It's all right there in front of us, y'all. It's all right there in front of us, y'all. Nehemiah has been lauded as a hero, and I'm not saying that Nehemiah does not do heroic things. I'm not saying Nehemiah is not important. But the people who have said over the years that Nehemiah is a hero and an example are oftentimes the very ones who are manipulating individuals into doing and giving in ways that may be counterproductive to the kingdom of God, because they're building their own kingdoms instead. Whenever people lift up the story of Nehemiah as something that should be emulated, as a call to action, the question should always be, whose kingdom is this person building? Because Nehemiah Nehemiah was not building God's kingdom. And we see the hints of that, which will become shouts from the very beginning. The king grants requests. Look at this. Because the gracious hand of God was on me. God never says, my hand is on you. But Nehemiah says all of these things happen because of God's gracious hand. We just supposed to take your word for it, Nehemiah? We're going to continue to see Nehemiah and the people who pulled together Nehemiah's journals entries in order to make this book. We're going to continue to see God being leveraged to do things that are at best questionable as to whether they're building God's kingdom. And you should always question whenever people say, God told me to do this. The gracious hand of God has enabled me to do this. God has blessed, and so this is taking place. Anytime anybody jumps to that level in order to put words in God's mouth or to assign actions or blessings to God, danger, Will Robinson. Don't blame your plan on God. You are more than welcome to ask and invite God to be a part of your plan. You are more than welcome to thank God whenever things go well. Don't blame your plan on God. Don't blame the bad things in life that happen to you on God, and don't blame the good things in life that happen to you on God. And oftentimes it's difficult to tell the difference between what is a good thing and what is a bad thing in life because we are too close to the situation. Many people have walked away from God because he has given credit for things that were not his doing by people who are building their own kingdoms and yet assign it to God. Don't do that. Well, I've gone over time today. I hope that you have seen things in this passage that I have not seen. And in the comments, as you watch this or read through this chapter, I hope that as you're journaling in your book and coming up with a big idea that you think that this section is about or that you have learned from this section, that you will let us know those things as well. Continue on the conversation in the comments. Good to see you. Be back with you tomorrow as we continue on. But until that time, happy reading.